But the idea of this working group is to cover statistical methods and presentations of results. So the way I interpreted that, at least, was to kind of give an overview of what the experiments are already providing in terms of their interpretations of the data, and also some methods for reinterpreting how we can recast that data. So there's obviously a bit of crossover with working group 1, but nevertheless there'll be some different things. So I'm Nick, and Andy is going to be joining us next week. Okay, so you probably know this fairly well, but the sort of basic schema for how we make interpretations is we assume that there's some real kind of truth level physics process going on. So here some sort of TT bar production, and we imagine once that gets fed through our detector, some response and smearing happens, and then we end up with a reconstructed event. So this is a reconstructed TT bar event from CMS. And then we can make comparisons between, say, what we expect from theory. So if we put Monte Carlo simulation through the same procedure, we can compare with the data and make some interpretation there. So I try to mix Atlas and CMS as much as possible here to not be biased. So I am aware that this is a CMS detector with an Atlas plot. And of course, we also try and go the other way. If we start off with our observed data, so we just have counts in some bins, then we can also, using this same knowledge of how the detector works, we can try and unfold that data. And then that gives us the ability to compare directly, again, at the sort of truth or generator level, our unfolded data and our Monte Carlo simulation. So we also can compare on this side as well and make interpretations, as Darren already mentioned. Okay, so just quickly then, which results do we already get from the experiments? So when we consider searches, we typically get things like limits in terms of, so we have upper limits in terms of production cross-sections and branching ratios. So typically whenever you see like a resonance search, this is what you're going to get. So here's an example from, this is a Z-gamma search. So looking for 2 leptons and a photon, and then you take the invariant mass, and you end up with upper limits on some production cross-section and branching ratios. So this is really appropriate when you have a narrow width or resonance being produced. You can also get upper limits on fiducial or visible cross-sections. So this is the case usually when there's things that are less narrow, you have some wide resonance, or even something which doesn't show up as a peak. You can nevertheless make a simple selection and then just count the number of events and infer that as a visible cross-section, if you like. Then you also commonly see things like limits on mass and coupling planes. So example here is from Susie, where you basically see these contours show you the reach of the exclusion in terms of some Susie parameters. So one thing that we could be discussing in this group is whether or not there's enough information already included on these plots, and whether or not it's useful to include things like this color scheme. So you sometimes see different conventions going on with the color scheme. So in this case, there's the color is showing you the 95% upper limit on the cross-section in this case. But it may be that it's more useful to express the exclusion. So I put expulsion for some reason. But that's supposed to say exclusion level on this z-axis instead. Or one, or both, or the other. I mean, we can discuss what's more or less useful. Okay, then, so for measurements, so this is typically talking about measurements of observables or physics parameters. So a good example here, a fairly recent one, is from the Higgs analyses. So looking at production and decay rates, so in the form of these new simplified template cross-sections. This is a nice result from Atlas, where they show you here on the left, these are the sort of black points are the maximum likelihood estimates for these various processes. So here the gluon fusion process broken down into different bins of number of jets and PT ranges. Normalized to the standard model, of course, so that you have the nice reference at 1. And then these error bars are the 68% confidence intervals. But they also provide these correlations between the different measurements, so you can actually see at least some approximation of what the full likelihood is from this thing. So you also sometimes see likelihood scans or contours. So often you see contours, and in some cases you also see the full scan. So for example, here on this is a CMS result. Again, this is just some 2 Higgs couplings parameters. This is just effective coupling of the Higgs to the gluon and to the photon. And you can see that the correlation structure is fairly, well, it's non-Gaussian for one thing, but it's non-trivial in this particular case. So it could be that if we actually have more plots like this, where the likelihood is given as a color scale, we could actually go beyond this Gaussian approximation when we're trying to build up our likelihoods. Okay, so then another kind of result is so we heard a lot about this already from Darren's talk, is the differential distributions. So typically differential cross-sections are unfolded to some level. So the idea is that you remove detector effects, and it's good for comparisons to theory. So you can directly take a prediction from theory and then them. And the idea is that they're somewhat model, I should say model independent, but actually that's not the case. So maybe it's more correct to have model dependent. So then there are some limitations, obviously, that come with this. So typically you have to come up with a response matrix. This is just basically a linear approximation of what happens in the detector. And if you have large off-diagonal terms, then you can, so for example, you have some observer which has a very low resolution, like missing energy or something like that, then this can lead to kind of either instabilities or certainly non-Gaussian behaviors. You also have the issues with background subtraction, although you can get around this by using a fitting method instead. And then finally, you can introduce quite severe biases from regularization. So again, if you have large off-diagonal terms when you're doing the unfolding, you might want to include some kind of regularization. And there's a whole slew of papers that tell you why that's a bad idea or why that's a good idea. And that's something to be careful of. So things we can discuss is really what's the best way to handle the uncertainties when regularization has been used. So okay, it's all very well to say we have the measurements and their correlations, but how do we actually deal with them? What's the best way to interpret those? And also, how can we combine with other measurements? So once you have the unfolded data and the systematics there, it's very difficult to then combine that with other distributions unless you also have the correlations between different analyses. Okay, so finally, just a quick word on auxiliary materials. So it's not just the results that the experiments put out, and it's certainly not just the things that go in the paper. There are also additional materials on the Twickies, and if you're lucky, in Hep data as well. So these include things like the description and the analysis, so something like a rivet routine would go in there. Sometimes there's standalone code for complex variables, so you may have some, I don't know, variable that combines different jets and MET and then spits out some number. And there's often some C or root macro or just some C++ code that will calculate that for you. And then there's things like object level or selection efficiencies. So here's just an example from CMS where you can just go to this web page, click on one of these links, and it brings up a nice table of efficiencies of, so this is a muon efficiency versus PT and eta for this particular analysis. And then also same thing from Atlas here, but this is looking at the overall model efficiency for a particular analysis. So we should be discussing really, is this enough at least to use this kind of information either instead of or perhaps to correct the detector response from something like from Delphis. So obviously if we have parameterization of the response in Delphis, we can then make fine-tunings based on the information that the experiments give us. And then also questions like what if MVA variables are used? Excuse me. So this might be something that's very specific to a particular analysis, particular experiment, even a particular time of running the analysis. These MVAs can change from conference to conference. So perhaps it would be useful to actually have those BDT weights or whatever XML files are used also available. Okay, so then the second part is going to be more on the statistical tools for reinterpretation, so the kind of things that are out there for recasting these analyses. So the first one is what I call simplified likelihoods. So the idea here is to try and reconstruct the likelihood from the experiment using just a minimal set of information. So very basic kind of set of information you require for this one. Just the data, so again, just the number of events that I see in a particular bin. And then the expected rates and covariances between those rates for the backgrounds. So there's a couple of different ways of deriving these. You can either derive them analytically from the Hessian or sample them from Monte Carlo toys or whatever you like. But the idea is you can just plug this whole thing into a generic sort of likelihood in this form, and then these can be plugged into some generic recasting tools like Gambit or whatever else. So this is a fairly good starting point to go beyond the simple, if you like, just comparing theory predictions to the data. You'll always have this question whether or not the limits are too pessimistic or optimistic. So if we include the correlations, then you're at least sort of working towards resolving that issue. So obviously we want to try and study the limitations of this process, Low event yields is one issue. So the nice thing about the simplified likelihood is, of course, you have the Poisson term right here, so you don't have to worry about any kind of Gaussian approximation there, but you have this nasty term which can break down. So looking at the various limitations in that would be useful for this group. And then also maybe going beyond linear correlation. So we only have the first term in an expansion in potential of, you know, we could expand this as far as we want. Do we want to do that? Is it useful? And is there a way that we can go beyond just that linear term anyway? Okay, so another question on simplified likelihoods is, can we provide more to overcome some of those limitations? So there's a few different kind of areas we could work towards. So firstly, reducing the complexity. So there's often complaints from people trying to use searches, especially SUSY searches, that there are too many regions, that it's too complicated to do everything. So maybe providing aggregated search reasons like CMS does, or maybe just single search regions that are the most sensitive for a particular type of model like Atlas is doing, might be more useful for phenomenologists. We could think about diagonalizing, and then sort of, so you have the covariance matrix, you might want to sort of order that in terms of the highest eigenvalues, and then only apply a cutoff on the eigenvalue, and then only provide the eigenvectors above above some threshold. So that might help with reducing the complexity of these things. We might want to try and improve the recastability or combinability by providing breakdowns of the covariance into different sources. So typically these are just given as one lump with all the systematics folded in. But if we break down into things that are more related to the signal modeling, or things that are more related to the jet energy scale, or the theory, or whatever, then it may be that as things improve over time, we can shrink those, and update that information. And also that would allow us to correlate with other searches if we know which systematics are going where. And there's also a nice idea from Karl Cramner in this paper, which is to reparameterize or provide reparameterization templates for the likelihood. And in this way, you end up decoupling the theory from the experimental systematics, and then you have this nice sort of analytic form of the signal systematics, so that you can basically update them as you change your theory or improve your theory predictions. You can update the systematics on the fly if you like. And then the third one there is just to increase the accuracy of the simplified likelihood itself. So this could be by providing the likelihood numerically in some optimal way. So not a simple grid of likelihood points, but maybe using machine learning techniques to try and find the most useful points for reconstruction of the likelihood. Maybe we can think about packaging the likelihood into some standalone tool set. So for example, this his factory thing has been around for a while. It's quite a nice way. It's quite user-friendly for people to use. Or maybe just directly providing Monte Carlo toys. So we just provide the sampling toys directly, and then we can reconstruct the likelihood from that. That could be one way to go. Wanted to mention one final little alternative for recasting, and that's to use reweighting. So one way that you can imagine recasting some data set or some analysis is to, basically you're talking about replacing some original hypothesis, so we call it P0, from the search with some new hypothesis, P1. So you end up with basically something that looks like this. So if the experiment gives you something like the response to the detector and the cuts and all this kind of thing, you can encode it as some function, which is basically a smearing function. And then you're able to actually just replace, so here, for example, you're able to replace the red hypothesis with the blue one here, just by reweighting of these two probability distributions. So obviously you can, if you have many dimensions that you're doing this in, this can be a bit of a task. But again, you can use machine learning techniques in order to most optimally find the points with which you can reweight. So there's the example here, Carl, which is a fairly new project, which the idea behind is exactly this, an efficient resampling efficient sampling for that reweighting. So again, questions: can we standardize the form of this W? Are the experiments going to give us something that we can put in a parametric form like this? And basically, will the experimentalists get on board? Or can we try and obtain this kind of function from Delphis, from efficiency maps, and all the stuff that's already available? Okay, so the final point here is just, if you like, maybe a bit more of the boring stuff, but to standardize the presentation of results. So obviously there's a number of recasting frameworks out there. I just listed only a few here. but there are a bunch of different workflows that are available, and most of this code is public as well. So there's Gambit, there's Checkmate, Recast or Rihanna, so this is one that Atlas is following quite closely. There's Rivet and Contour for encoding analyses and building likelihoods. And then there's also this recent paper, which is kind of a systematic search over SUSY search, aggregating bins into different, or aggregating regions and then trying to find excesses in the data. So it would be nice to try and figure out which of the assumptions that go into all of these different workflows, whether we can avoid those assumptions in a common way, and also maybe encourage standard languages. So there are obviously many tools out there for encoding histograms and metadata and things like that. So maybe we can encourage more often to use those standard languages so that we can share this information and these workflows more easily. So a final note is that obviously the recasting procedure is fairly similar for everyone. I stole this nice slide from Lucas from the workshop a couple of weeks ago. And the idea is you start off with some model information, some physics model, and the idea is to end up with some limit. And then there are a bunch of these different tools in the middle here that go from one to the other. So it'd be quite nice to get all this boring work done in terms of naming conventions and conventions for all the stuff that goes on inside here, to make sure that we can really exploit the LHC data in a systematic way. So rather than there being one or two analyses where this is perfect and others where it's not so great, it would be nice to have a sort of systematic way that all analyses can encode this information. So obviously the activities are already are underway in the form of the Forum for Interpretation of LHC Results, so we could use this as a starting point to move forward. Okay, so just to summarize, here are the ideas again for the activity. So on the experimental results side, we can look at some concrete requests for experimentalists to provide more information in the results, so more correlations, maybe more multidimensional likelihoods, that kind of thing. Really make some concrete suggestions. Maybe we want to think about specific maps for efficiencies and acceptances. So again, something like a parametric template, like that W function for reweighting. Maybe more comparisons to Delphi so that we know when we have to tune parameterizations of the detector, that kind of thing. Then on simplified likelihoods, again, more of a systematic study on the limitations of the different approaches. Look for ways to avoid the approximations that are being used, and one way about that would maybe provide toys for the sampling so that we can figure out some of this stuff ourselves. Breakdowns of uncertainty sources, so again, being able to correlate between different analyses and different experiments might be easy if we have a sort of sourcing or groupings of those uncertainties. And then some simplification, so reduction of dimensionality, as I said, eigenvector ranking is one, and maybe even producing some symbol codes or tools to package all of that stuff above so that we can all share these conventions easily. Then the final thing is the boring stuff, if you like, but nevertheless possibly one of the most important. Coming up with HEP data friendly formats, or some friendly formats that we can put all this, or basically all of the above into some common repository. And that may be just something as simple as providing metadata for the covariance matrices and efficiency maps and all that kind of thing, and common naming for the systematic groups or any of the improvements that we might make. So maybe one last thing to bear in mind is, when we're discussing with experimentalists what to provide, what not to provide, is that sometimes if we think of something really clever and it's a challenge for the experimentalist, then it can be quite inviting. So this is me trying to get up to Christ the Redeemer the hard way, but sometimes the simplest solution can also be just as appealing. So instead of doing the hike, you can take the train, and sometimes you get just as much enjoyment out of that process as the hard way. Okay, so thanks very much.